Have you ever imagined what human flesh might taste like? And is there any measure for the most perverted behaviors in the world regarding harming others? Is taking possession of bodies, torturing them with brutal methods, and preparing meals from human flesh ingredients the ultimate limit of crime? The intriguing investigation process that took 6 years by law enforcement certainly made many people try to forget this case, but crimes will eventually come to light, and today's case will surely make many people shudder. You are following the case of cannibal Albert Fish on the Crime Channel, and as usual, before listening to the main content, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated with the most impressive cases. It was on a Sunday, June 3rd, 1928, when Albert visited his friend's house at 406 West Street. He brought strawberries and had lunch at their house. At this time, the homeowner's daughter named Grace approached him, and he immediately had the idea to take possession of Grace. After lunch, he asked permission from her parents to take Grace to a party, but in reality, it was to carry out his plan. He took Grace to an abandoned house in Winchester City and told her to wait outside. He went inside, stripped off his clothes, and hid in the closet, waiting for Grace. When the girl entered and saw him in a state without any clothes, she screamed in fear. Fearing Grace would tell her parents, he chased after her and strangled her until she stopped breathing. After that, Albert's mind was truly no longer human. He turned the girl into his meal, in the literal sense. It took him 9 days to eat everything that remained of Grace. William King was one of the investigators who followed the case from the beginning. In the early 20th century, kidnappings typically targeted children from wealthy families for ransom, but in Grace's case, the kidnapper didn't demand anything. More ridiculous was that he didn't even need to break in. He casually entered the family's home and left with Grace with her parents' permission. The man posed as a wealthy farmer, looking for a young man to manage his farm. The first time he entered Grace's house was on May 28, 1928, at 3:30 p.m. Albert introduced himself as Frank Howard, needing to hire a farm manager. He knew about Edward, Buss's son, because Edward had posted a job-seeking ad. On June 3rd, he returned to the Buss family at 11 a.m. to meet Edward and asked permission to take Grace to a party that evening. He easily received the family's approval, but no one knew that would be the last time they saw their daughter. Back to the case. During the examination and investigation, William discovered a small hexagonal symbol with the initials NPCBA on the envelope containing the letter Albert left behind. These initials referred to the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association, located at 627 Lexington Avenue. Detective William went there and verified 400 handwriting samples from everyone in the association and found a clue about the subject's residence. Following up, William went to the boarding house at 200 East 52nd Avenue, met the landlady, and explained he was looking for a man named Frank Howard, who usually wore a suit, was about 60 years old, with gray hair and a mustache. The landlady, Frida Schneider, replied that there was no Frank Howard there, but there was a man quite similar to the police description named Albert Fish living upstairs, though he wasn't home that day. Therefore, Frida promised to call William when he returned. On December 13th, the landlady informed William that Albert was at the boarding house. Police immediately arrived to verify. When seeing William, Albert became defensive by pulling out a small knife from his pocket. With professional skills, police quickly subdued him, and the whole truth was revealed right in the detention room. Originally, Albert had planned to kidnap Edward, the Buss family's son, but given his strong build, he feared Edward would resist beyond his control and affect his plan. Therefore, he quickly changed his target to Grace. To execute his plan, he had prepared a knife and a saw in a box. After receiving Grace's parents' permission, he went to the train station and bought tickets to Winchester County. The travel time was 40 minutes. Upon reaching Winchester, he continuously led Grace through deserted streets, finally stopping at an abandoned house called Wisteria Cottage, nestled in the woods surrounded by dense trees. And what had to happen, happened. Grace was strangled to death by him. Not stopping there, he mercilessly destroyed the unfortunate girl's body. 9 days after the crime, Albert returned to bury Grace's remains in a stone wall at Wisteria Cottage. At that time, Albert, the perpetrator, was 63 years old. Albert Fish was born on May 19, 1870, in Washington. His father, Randall Fish, was a former Marine who retrained to become a fertilizer manufacturer. When Albert was born, his father was 70 years old and died 5 years later due to poor health. Albert's mother, who was 23 years younger than her husband, was a housewife and had to raise 4 children. When Albert was 5 years old, his mother had to send him to an orphanage because she lacked the conditions and strength to teach and care for 4 children. Throughout his 8 years in the orphanage, Albert was constantly physically harassed. He was continuously teased and tortured, but he didn't show weakness. On the contrary, he seemed quite fond of the children's games. When he was 9, Albert's mother took him out of the orphanage because she had found a more stable job. After returning home to reunite with his mother and siblings, Albert showed great interest in the stories his second older brother told. Stories of debauchery like brutal robbery and murder of others. He was also frequently shown pictures of beautiful girls by his brother, but Albert seemed uninterested. Every night, he thought and dreamed about harming multiple people and turning victims into his food. At age 12, Albert began showing strange preferences. At 15 to 16 years old, Albert would go to public bathhouses, or more accurately, to changing rooms, to peek at other young men undressing. At 17, he found his first job as a painter. Under a perfect cover, he frequently went to paint and decorate old, dilapidated buildings in the area. He volunteered at orphanages and schools to seek target victims. His first victims, when he was around 20 to 25 years old, were black children from poor families. At that time, racial discrimination was strong in America, which was why he targeted these subjects, because no one cared about their disappearance. Typically, Albert would lure victims with sweet candies or cute puppies and lock them up in abandoned houses in the forest. His usual acts were brutal beating and starvation until the victims died. In 1894, Albert came to New York, married, and had children. His wife was Anna Mary, and they had 6 children: Albert Jr., Anna, Gertrude, Eugene, John, and Henry. In 1903, Albert's mother passed away, and that same year, he was sentenced to 16 months in prison for embezzlement after stealing from the cash register at the grocery store where he worked. In 1911, Albert met Thomas Kedden, a 19-year-old homeless man with mental disorders. Immediately, he rented a private room and took Thomas there. First, he shaved Thomas's head because the young man was full of lice. At that time, Albert was 41 years old and was preparing to spend 3 weeks beside Thomas. Albert begged Thomas to be happy about him, and over the next 3 weeks, Albert tortured Thomas in various ways, leaving many wounds on his body. After being satisfied, he gave Thomas $10 and released him. During the time he was torturing Thomas, Albert didn't return home and didn't contact his wife. On January 19, 1917, after 19 years of living together and having 6 children, Anna Mary decided to leave the family home. However, just 3 months later, she returned and asked Albert for forgiveness because her new lover was abusive and she couldn't live with him. Albert agreed to let Anna return home, and he discovered the shocking truth that his wife and her lover were secretly living together in their family home. A rage occurred. Everything in the house flew everywhere and broke. Not long after marriage, Albert's mental state increasingly deteriorated. He lived alone, and to reduce pressure, Albert would often beat himself with whips right in front of his children. He still used whips on his back to punish himself, to free himself from all sins. As time passed, each of his children had to leave him after discovering their father's abnormalities. Perhaps due to loneliness, Albert tried to kidnap an 8-year-old girl on July 11, 1924, in the Tronwood neighborhood north of Staten Island. Betty Kegel was playing alone on her parents' farm when Albert approached her. He offered money in exchange for a short trip with her. Betty accepted, but fortunately, her mother saw her leaving with a man who was later described as an elderly gentleman with gray hair. He even brazenly returned to sleep in the barn that very night, and was chased away by Hans, the family's father. 3 days after the incident, an 8-year-old boy named Francis McDonnell was approached by an old man with a gray mustache and graying hair, wearing a nice suit. It was late afternoon, and Francis was playing football in the public park with some friends. Realizing the boy's disappearance a few minutes later, Francis's friends began searching and calling, but there was no answer. Francis's father was a police officer, so a search by law enforcement quickly began. The last person to see Francis was neighbor George Stern, around 4:30 p.m., who saw the child walking past his house with an old man who seemed to be leading the boy down a secluded path through the woods. 3 detectives, Henry Lano, Thomas Perrin, and Henry Wood, quickly discovered Francis McDonald's body trapped inside the forest, with clothes and accessories torn apart, brutally tortured until disfigured before death. Francis's father asked to join the investigation team. However, at that time, there were no security cameras in every corner like today, and there were no clues for police to continue following the case, and time just passed by. The death of the 8-year-old child drifted into oblivion. 2.5 years after Francis McDonald's murder, Billy Gaffney, age 4, became the next victim of the man described as wearing gray clothes. At the end of February 11th, 1927, Billy, a skinny 4-year-old, was playing on the first floor with dim light alongside the neighbor's son, Billy Beaton, age 3, and Johnny, age 12. When Albert appeared to lure the children, Johnny went upstairs to comfort his sleeping sister. So the girl didn't know exactly what happened. When he returned to the first floor, the 2 boys, Billy and Beaton, had disappeared. Beaton's grandfather went searching around, but didn't discover anything unusual. And of course, 2 children ages 3 and 4 certainly couldn't go far in a short period of just a few dozen minutes. Immediately, Beaton's grandfather realized his grandson was being kidnapped. He followed sounds on the upper floor and found Beaton there. The boy described a man with graying hair, a long beard, wearing gray clothes who'd taken him to the upper floor to look at chimneys and steam trains along with Billy, after which Billy followed him. However, no one believed the boy's words. Law enforcement also thought Beaton was talking nonsense, and Billy was probably walking alone and would return soon. The logic of law enforcement at that time was that if someone kidnapped children, they would certainly choose wealthy families to demand ransom. A wide-ranging search was conducted by Billy's neighbors across rivers and canals near Billy's home. However, the boy was not found. This is why at that time, serial kidnappers all targeted minorities or the poor because no one cared if they disappeared, and most cases were assumed to be runaways. At that time, Albert was working as a house painter for a real estate company in Brooklyn, and on the day Billy Gaffney disappeared, he was working just a few miles from where the boy was kidnapped. A streetcar driver, Anthony Barron, had seen Billy on the day he went missing around 7 p.m., walking with an old man with a gray mustache. The man seemed worried and asked for directions to East Street, after which he got on the ferry. He was Albert. Billy's body was later found in a box at an abandoned house on a New York street. Everyone who witnessed the discovery felt goosebumps because of Albert's inhumane behavior. Each part of Billy was put separately into bags. Then he disposed of them by throwing the bags into swamps along the way to North Beach. Other parts he took home and cooked in the oven at level 4 with some onions and sauce, making the meal tastier and sweeter than roast turkey. No meal could be as delicious as what he prepared himself. Only when Detective William began investigating the case of Grace's kidnapping and disappearance was the truth revealed. It turned out that the demon still existed in broad daylight in beautiful America. Albert was the killer who carried out many brutal cases that authorities had been worried about for decades. Until 1934, Albert was arrested by Detective William and charged with intentional murder. The press published articles at a dizzying rate. The person who caused Grace's death was finally caught. Immediately, many parents spoke up about their suspicions of Albert. He was truly an inhumane person. His former landlady, Helen, had refused to continue renting to Albert, and to take revenge, he repeatedly wrote letters with vulgar words and threw them under her door. The day he moved out, he defecated all over the room for the landlady to clean up. Mrs. Laff also made accusations that Albert had tried to lure her daughter with candy just 2 months before he was arrested. The most frightening thing was that there was a witness who reported encountering Albert with his suspicious behavior from July 1924. That was when Albert was just 16 years old. Until the time of his arrest, Albert was 63 years old. Thus, it's impossible to know exactly how many victims he had harmed. In the early 20th century, the internet hadn't developed, and technology was still primitive and backward. Therefore, if they wanted to investigate, they had to approach each of Albert's neighbors from when he was young until now. A brief investigation during the time Albert worked as a painter at apartments, schools, and orphanages identified 15 victims. According to a psychologist's estimate, throughout Albert's life, he might have harmed at least 100 victims with his deviant and inhumane thoughts. After being arrested, many signs of psychological instability were also exhibited by him throughout his sentence. Many times, he stabbed sewing needles into his body to torture himself. Another time, he used sharpened chicken bones in his cell to cut into his chest. For his horrific crimes, only one of his 6 children agreed to stand against their father, while the other 5 children remained on good terms with Albert and regularly wrote letters to keep in touch. Albert Jr., his son, recounted all of Albert's behaviors. On full moon nights, Albert would pretend to transform and would certainly eat a raw steak to satisfy his bloodthirst. Other times in his sleep, he would scream Grace's name. In contrast, his other children even cried for their father in court. At the same time, 3 psychologists also stood up to defend Albert, believing he had psychological disorders and couldn't control his behavior. Finally, the scales of justice still tipped toward the victims. Albert had to face the death penalty by electric chair. Perhaps when committing his crimes, he never thought about the scenario of becoming America's top criminal with inhumane behaviors never before seen in history. A person who would later be recorded in books describing crimes that the world could not forgive. On January 16, 1936, Albert, age 65, was executed by electric chair at Sing Sing prison at 11:06 p.m., and to this day, no one knows the exact number of victims Albert had harmed throughout his life. What do you think about this shocking case? What do you think is the exact number of Albert's victims? And do you believe he really dared to eat human flesh? Please share your thoughts in the comments section, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the Crime Channel to encourage us. There are many more classic cases from around the world that we will bring to you in upcoming videos. For now, goodbye, and see you again.